experience in the army and your identification with it will vary according to the group, the social group, or the demographic group, or the national group that you belong to. I suppose to put that in context, so too, if you're from the same country, say South Africa, a white South African officer and a Black South African soldier will have very different experiences in the organization. And you can both be Black, say from Malawi, but what is the intersection of gender and race that will undoubtedly influence your experience in the organization in a way that race alone will not? I think that often gets underlooked because we have to consider the influence of patriarchy, power, and hierarchy, and what that means to be a woman from a minoritized group within our organization. So that seems very complex. And I think you would be asking, how do we pull this all together? And I would say it's by being better at the things that we should be good at and that we are good at. And that is capturing data, doing the research, looking at our policies and making them evidence-based. Next slide, please. So I'll just leave you to sort of read this quote that I sort of picked out, which for me really gets to the heart of social identity, group identity, and that the constant movement in between. Okay, now this was taken from my research, and it's something that I hear often in the organization currently, and it's all about sort of identifying with the organization, right? I think our social identity is about the groups we belong to and arguably speaks to our sense of self. And the groups we identify with are very context dependent. So we carry with us intersections all the time. And I would say prior to summer of 2020, there was an expectation that we sort of compartmentalize these and made explicitly an identification with the organization. So we would talk a lot about soldier first. And that's sort of illustrated by that sort of quote above. But the questions I asked during my research and some of the questions that I still see being played out today is around whether or not this soldier first identity was the predominant one. And for most of the respondents in my study, it was not. And I think the way that we sort of interact and group people in the way that some of our policies are developed, I would say that that is true. As I sort of mentioned before, kind of your identity is context dependent. So when we are impacted by policies that make us feel othered, it's very difficult to create a space where there are opportunities to bring our authentic selves to work. And for the Army, the importance of psychological safety in terms of being able to challenge effectively is critical. And that's why we have developed an organizational culture measurement where we can look at inclusion in a real way. We have trained over 3,600 allies through briefings across the organization, highlighting the importance of speaking up, speaking out, and inclusion. And we are optimizing employee networks in order that we develop that cross-organizational support. And we're working more at the intersections than we ever have before to get at this issue of where do I feel safe to show up? Where do I feel safe to challenge? Where do I feel safe to be the best that I can be? And do I have to almost compartmentalized and shut off sort of parts of myself. Next slide, please. As I sort of mentioned, there's a sort of no getting around the fact that the army is hierarchical. It is bottom third. You have to work your way up. There is no lateral entry to sort of command appointments. So I've just highlighted power and hierarchy here to acknowledge the role that this plays in the journey towards achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in a complex structure where we have CAP badges, units, and subunits, and they all have unique identities, I think the ability to challenge constructively and effectively is more important than ever. Next slide, please. And just sort of to say, in addition to power and hierarchy, what we would see on this slide here is that your identity is also influenced by how you are employed by the organization. So whether you are on a regular contract, a reserve contract, civilian contract, or a contractor supporting the organization, there are all sort of sub-identities and sort of subcultures, which again is not germane to the army, but it's one that makes our sort of journey to sort of inclusion and belonging just slightly more complex and slightly less straightforward than some other organizations. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be also important to highlight where the lived experience of our minority ethnic personnel kind of sits within the organization, because whilst the lived experience of ethnic minority personnel as a group may share some similarities, those who are non-UK nationals tend to have a much more difficult experience navigating the organization. And just sort of at this slide, it's influenced, kind of the experience you have of the organization is influenced by your rank, nationality, by the intersections of race and gender. We have ethnic minority personnel overrepresented in our service complaints process. Minoritized personnel, they progress slower throughout the organization. And there tends to be, as the slide sort of earlier alluded to, a reliance on individuals to change and fit in, and we sort of still carry that, and that's an issue that we do have to grapple with as we sort of put structures and systems in place to ensure that people have an equal opportunity to come to work and show up as themselves, and that's not just a privilege for some. Next slide, please. So I've done a pretty good job of laying out the challenges, and I'm sure you're asking, well, there's so many issues. What do you do? Where do you go from here? And I think, I do need to sort of explain that we need to ensure that our journey towards equality of opportunity for all is taking us along the right path by sort of thinking about it and sort of four main areas for us in the organization. I think the future is important, and resourcing, because people talk a lot about, I say people, some organizations do a lot of talking around how they want things to get better. But I think sometimes when you scratch the surface of it, the resourcing isn't necessarily there to do that. And I think the future for our organization is positive. And I think we've taken this, we've broken it down into sort of 4 sort of main areas. I mean, there are more, but I think for the purposes of today, it's useful just to sort of talk through those. The first thing is that we have a campaign plan, which is a significant part of us getting to that end state that was agreed by the executive committee of the Army Board. And that is to get to a place where the Army is an organization that is justifiably recognized as an employer of choice, where everyone can bring their whole selves to work and where we can challenge each other and deal with unacceptable behavior effectively. So that sort of portfolio of work is managed by me, and it covers a gambit of everything from how we're going to ensure that our policies are evidence-based, to looking at organizational culture, through to considering what we are doing with sort of people's careers and making sure that people have the training that is required to deliver operational effectiveness through considering each other as sort of team members. And that brings me to the next point, sort of Army teamwork. And I kind of think, well, what does that concept mean? Okay, teamwork, it's fairly straightforward. But the Army does teamwork well, from battle groups to platoons. What we're talking about here is the concept of teamwork to relay the message to the organization that every member of the team has a place. Our internal communications campaign around building on and respecting and valuing each member of the team exactly because they bring a unique experience to the organization is being developed, and it's one that we are sort of constantly refining, because we can talk to people about diversity and inclusion, and sometimes that doesn't land. It doesn't land very well. People feel like it's, you get the eye roll, it's political correctness gone mad. There's people that you're trying to sort of curb our sort of natural sort of way of sort of correcting ourselves. Why do we have to be told? And so making that relatable and making it understandable to the operational effectiveness discussion is paramount for us. And in order to do that, we have to think about, what is going to land. And we need to speak to people in a way that is understood. And we've interpreted that as sort of looking at a team, valuing each member of a team, and understanding that people bringing difference to the team is exactly what we want, particularly for where we need to go. So we've got our sort of levels of ambition, and that is a resource plan to ensure that we are not sort of outsourcing representation. We're thinking about how much bolder can we be at bringing in diverse talent to the organization, and what are some of the barriers in doing that. And then I think most importantly, or without this piece, which is the cultural piece, none of the other bits could work. And that is sort of looking at Army organizational culture, looking at the culture within which some of these issues are able to sort of become apparent. The culture within which people can thrive, the culture in which we can develop high-performing teams. And we've clarified what we mean by organizational culture. Just as we've seen with the lived experience, the culture of units is varied and influenced by all those things that I sort of spoke about earlier. But what we've done is to set the expectation that culture will look like people being able to come to work and be their whole selves. People are able to sort of come to work and contribute. People are able to come to work and feel valued. And that is the culture within which we need to sort of progress. And it's not just the challenge that we're presenting to our leaders. We are supporting them through an enhanced process of measurement and actually giving them support to sort of develop their units. And we've built on evidence to be able to do this. And over time, as we build the data, we will be held accountable for that, not only from our sort of senior leaders, but those inside the organization as well, who are able to put their hands up, challenge, and raise a question. And I think really, as we apply more resource and continue the dialogue, we will be able to progress more effectively along this journey. And like all journeys, getting to the destination is sometimes never clear cut, and there will be setbacks. But by having a plan, and by having that plan resourced, and by having the commitment of leadership, we stand a very, very good chance of getting there. Next slide, please. So I think why do we need to get this right? You know, I'm sure we will all agree that there is a sort of legal and moral imperative for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the operational imperative is crucial and needs significantly more focus. And when we think about why we need to get this right, we do have to consider military capability. This is critical to military capability. If we are thinking of a future soldier, who do we want to come to this organization? Are we thinking of individuals who are going to be more agile, more able to challenge us, and who have an expectation of a progressive organization? So we have to get it right if we're thinking of resourcing this organization into the future. And ultimately, sort of team cohesion and organizational effectiveness is critical, because without team cohesion, there will be no organizational effectiveness, and there will be very little, there will be a sort of effective capability. So I think whilst for commercial organizations, the bottom line is ultimately sort of profit to be made from having diverse experiences and solutions and sort of problem solving. The bottom line for the Army is about being successful in operations. It's also about upholding our professional reputation and credibility and ensuring that we enhance team cohesion in order to operate effectively. We need our people to innovate. We need them to feel safe, to challenge, and support each other to do better. But most of all, we need to get this right because we need to keep each other safe. Next slide, please. And so sort of a conclusion, so I'm mindful of the time, giving us sort of maximum time to have a conversation. I think, you know, I've just outlined here sort of where we are and the sort of the key points for today. I'm sure that, you know, from what you've heard so far, you might have a view on sort of how we're doing, but it's just to say that the Army is in the sort of the foothills of what may be a long journey, and we are rightly being monitored closely and held accountable along the way. There is absolutely a genuine desire to do better and deliver more for all of those who serve in the organization and those who support our serving personnel. And we have to get it right for those both inside and those who are on the outside looking in, wanting to join, or who may be hesitant. So we have to absolutely get this right. And it's not just about the lived experience, but it's about progression and development and demonstrating that that is happening. So there aren't any silver bullets for us. The journey is complex and will be arduous at times. But what we're doing now and what we have been doing for some time is laying that sort of structural foundation upon which to build and scale in order to make change last. Thank you so much for your attention this afternoon, and I'll hand back to Paul. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Melissa, thank you very much for a really tour de force overview. I think you were being remarkably modest when you said you think you've done a pretty good job. I think you did better than that in explaining the challenges that you face and the importance of getting it right and the approach you're talking about taking. And what particularly struck me was the sophistication in what you have described, which is new. I haven't heard it described in quite those ways before. And your point about the myth of homogeneity, I think, was so important to get beneath the skin on this. And a more individual approach that recognizes that not everybody in that group that might loosely be described as BAME is the same. I liked your points about intersectionality, the disparity of white and non-white positions in the organization from those coming from the Commonwealth, and the key question perhaps about how far the army is willing or able to change to create that sense of belonging you have described. And I was reminded in that of the Chilcot report, which made the point after the 2003 Iraq war that challenge was really important. And it strikes me that diversity provides us with an opportunity to provide that challenge into the way the organization traditionally thinks, but also to challenge that organization to be more accommodating of people who aren't entirely the same because they come from different cultural or neurodiverse perspectives. But we're now into question and answer session. As a reminder to everybody that Q&A is off the record, so we will stop the recording. Please lodge your questions in the Q&A part of the chat. We've already got a number of questions. If you would, please put your name with that. And if indeed you wish to, place your affiliation if you'll feel comfortable in doing so. But to pick up on a couple of questions,